Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here at Colonial Williamsburg today for a sample of one of our evening programs, Revolutionary Points of View. I'm Cash Earhart. I'm the supervisor at the Capitol building. I'm so grateful that you have taken the time to join with us today to discuss the beginning of the American Revolution and the factors that would have influenced people's decisions as to whether or not they would have supported the cause of American liberty or remained loyal to the king, or perhaps found another path. It doesn't seem logical to assume that everyone woke up on the morning of July 4th, 1776, united in one opinion that it was time to declare independence. It wasn't even true that many people supported that opinion as the war began over a year before independence was declared. And just like today, people have different opinions, different perspectives, different experiences that influence the way they view the world around them. What we'd like to share with you now are three perspectives from residents of Williamsburg just before independence was declared, and learn why they supported or opposed independence, or why they were forced to take that other path. I hope you will enjoy hearing from these three residents and their revolutionary points of view.
Good day. My name is John Mosley, owned by Edward Mosley, Prince Anne County. Not long ago, Master Edward was at the Raleigh Tavern, drinking in one of the private rooms with friends. I remember them talking about the king, about Parliament, about freedom. And Master Edward looked at his friends and said, "I tell you, I cannot believe what this king is trying to do to us. It is time for us to throw off the shackles and no longer be a slave to King George." And at that moment, he motioned for me to come over and pour his drink for him. Then I started to think, why would I not want to throw off my shackles, no longer be a slave to him? And that's what I've done. I made my way to Lord Dunmore, Norfolk, to the British lines. And as you can see, liberty to slaves. I've joined the British Army. They are offering it. When I return to Williamsburg, it won't be as property. It'll be as a free man liberating his home. But that means that I will not be here any longer. I will need to take my leave. So I will say good day to you, but I hope that when this war is over, you're still healthy and you find yourselves as free as I now find myself today. And I thank King George III. God save the king!
My friends, fellow Virginians, I beg you to hear me and hear me plain. I'm certain that you recognize me. My name is George Wythe. I've spent these past several months as your representative to the 2nd Virginia Convention, but I stand before you now as you do, a concerned freeholder of this colony. It has come to my attention that our royal governor, Lord Dunmore, has had a sudden change of residence. It appears he has fled Williamsburg in the middle of the night and now seeks refuge in the arms of the British Navy on the Chesapeake Bay. And now what? Just last year, he closed the courts, disbanded our government, and now he flees the city entirely. And leaves us to what? Martial law, the rule of the sword. You may be asking yourself, what can we expect for Williamsburg? My neighbors, you must only look north. Look north to our brothers in Boston. We will be left to the tender mercies of the redcoats. They will close our ports, they will ruin our trade, and they will continue to infringe upon our rights as free-born Britons. We must be prepared to defend our rights, just as our brothers have in Lexington and Concord. Up in Massachusetts, when those lobsterbacks marched out into the peaceful countryside to expand their military occupation, they were met with force. And now we must be prepared to do the same. Even now, my neighbors, Lord Dunmore is preparing a force to attack. He has called upon troops from Florida. He is inciting loyalist forces. And my neighbors, he has now even threatened to arm our slaves against us. The time is now. My neighbors, we must heed the call of the independent companies. Join me tomorrow on the green. Volunteer your time. Bring your muskets, your rifles, your fowlers, whatever you may have. We now have very little time to prepare for the coming battle. Walete, be well, and God save Virginia.
Your attention, I pray, good people. My name is Katherine Roth, Milliner, and I have an announcement. My shop is now closed. I am, in fact, now awaiting the carter to remove the last of my inventory and my belongings. I am sure that you understand what this stoppage of trade with England means for the likes of me. I am no longer able to remain in business, and I must forfeit my livelihood. I have been brought to the edge of ruin by these political malcontents. Forgive my sharp tongue, but my reputation is destroyed, and there are threats of violence against people like me. Poor Mr. Anthony Warwick was set in the stocks, tarred and feathered, and run out of the town of Smithfield under a shower of rotten eggs, all because he would not acknowledge the supposed authority of that Congress in Philadelphia. Oh yes, times have changed here in Virginia, with the hotheads at the Capitol building, encouraging good British subjects to defy their own king and parliament. Well, I am not impressed with the likes of Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson complaining about their rights. What about my rights? I have not been able to import a scrap of British goods for the past 8 months. Your Continental Congress saw to that. How am I expected to continue my business? I am a widow. I have no means other than my shop to provide for myself. I have no interest in this political argument either. As a woman, I cannot even vote, although I must pay the same taxes on my property as any gentleman freeholder must pay on his. My only wish is to be left alone to run my business, but that has been made impossible. You have heard of the Boston Tea Party. Well, last fall, a mob of so-called patriots in Yorktown had a tea party of their own, when they destroyed Mr. Prentice's property by hurling his shipment of tea into the York River. Had he not publicly apologized in the newspaper, I am certain his shop would have been destroyed as well. What is there to stop another mob from seizing my property or burning my shop? I tell you, I fear for my very life. The great Continental Congress and the Williamsburg Committee of Safety have reduced my world to two choices: starve in Virginia or return to England and attempt to build a new life. Well, I choose the latter. Your fine Virginia gentlemen have caused all of this by clamoring for their rights. Well, their cries for liberty will not feed my family. And so, this afternoon I leave for Yorktown to take passage upon the first available ship. For those of you who choose to remain here in Virginia, I bid you farewell. I will pray for your safety. I will pray for your lives. I will pray for your souls.
Even in Williamsburg, after the Revolutionary War had begun, there was still some room for different opinions, different perspectives on a matter as great and momentous as independence from the king. It's not dissimilar from today, when passions and personal opinions can run hot. I hope that you enjoyed hearing those different perspectives from the residents here in Williamsburg. If you were here to join us for Revolutionary Points of View in person as one of our evening programs, we would invite you to join us for a debate on the principles of whether or not we would declare independence, on if we would be able to successfully wage a war against a king and parliament with such tremendous military might, if we thought that we, the people of Virginia, were going to be capable of governing ourselves rather than relying on a governor sent to govern over us by the king. Since we aren't able to invite you to join us for that debate today directly, I'd like to introduce two other individuals who may appear familiar to you, my colleagues Stephen Seals and Robert Weathers, who portray John Mosley and George Wythe. To begin asking you two the questions, what surprised you about your character and their opinion on the Revolution as you were developing your monologue for this evening program? We'll begin with Stephen.
What I think surprised me the most was thinking through what would have been his thoughts in this. Because especially when I was much younger in school, when we were taught about the Revolution, it was very much taught as if most Americans thought, well, yes, of course, we need to be independent from England, when the honest reality is that the majority were either against independence or just didn't have a view on it in either direction. And learning that helped me even go further down the rabbit hole, because then you have even more perspectives. And for me, playing a character who used to be enslaved, well, what about their point of view? Because honestly, if they're looking at it, the person who owns them, who was considered a Briton, is now going to be the same person owning them, who's now going to be an American. To them, there's not going to be any change in their lives. So why is it going to matter to them whichever choice is made? Their thoughts are going to be on their opportunities to live the best life that they can. How can they be with their families? How can they gain freedom, if that's even something that can be afforded to them? Because especially in Virginia, under the law at that point in time, it was very difficult to do so. So looking at those perspectives and looking at the primary sources, because there are actually quite a few primary sources of the thoughts of the enslaved and of freed blacks in Virginia and in the Americas at that time, But being able to see those perspectives and then being able to bring them to a character, to someone who actually lived here, and to have people look at them and be able to be educated in those points of views by them, I think that was the greatest thrill that I had with this part. Yeah.
Good afternoon. Stephen and Cash are correct. There are varying degrees of opinions in the matter towards the matter of independence here in Virginia in the year 1775. Perhaps the greatest surprise for me as the person who interprets George Wythe was in my research of Mr. Wythe, I came to discover what a firebrand for independence he was. We know, or we are of the understanding that Mr. Wythe was born in late 1726 or early 1727, so he's about 50 years old in the year 1776. We also tend to think about him as the older generation. He's the tutor of Thomas Jefferson. He most likely is perhaps entering into his golden years, maybe even. And so you wouldn't necessarily expect that he would be so on fire for independence as he is. But in the monologue that you saw a moment ago, I made mention of joining up on the market square with the independent companies. And about this time of year, as a matter of fact, in 1775, Mr. Wythe puts on a hunting shirt very similar to the one that you saw Stephen wearing a moment ago, and he marches out onto the field with the independent companies in a display of his support for their mission here in Williamsburg, Virginia.
Those were great responses. And we've started to receive some questions from our viewers at home. Violet asked if slaves received their freedom if they fought for the British. What happened to them when they ran off to fight for the British?
That is a very good question, Violet. And a very complicated question, too, because quite a few different things happened. Because first they had to get to the British. And the Americans knew that they were trying to make their way to the British. So even being able to get behind British lines was difficult for many. And they took the opportunities when they could, and thousands made it. But there were also thousands that didn't, that were captured, that were punished, that were taken back. But if you did make it to the British, well, then that became complicated too. Because yes, they were offering you freedom, but I'm sure many of them knew that the British weren't offering them freedom because they believed in freedom for the Black Virginian. They were offering them freedom because they needed soldiers. They were offering them freedom because they needed their labor. It wasn't for out of the kindness of their hearts. And with that being the case, the way that they were dealt with tended to be shown in that manner. There is one battle that happens here in Virginia where Lord Dunmore's being defeated, and he decides to just let the blacks that he had serving with him, just throw them away. That also happens during the Battle of Yorktown. Cornwallis does that on the British side as well. So sometimes they were not treated particularly well. But after the war, the British actually did evacuate thousands of newly freed blacks to Nova Scotia, to Sierra Leone, to England. So in a lot of ways, they kept their promises. The Americans wanted their enslaved people back, and the British sent them all elsewhere before that could happen.
Our next question is from Laura. She asks, how much faith did revolutionary colonists have in George Washington as a military leader before he showed up at the Continental Congress wearing his uniform?
This is a great question. George Washington did, in fact, come to the Continental Congress wearing a military uniform that he had still from the French and Indian War. And the Virginians and the other inhabitants of North America did have some faith in his capability. Otherwise, he would not have been put into the position of the commander of the army. One of the major factors, though, of placing Washington into command of the army was by the fact simply that he was Virginian. Virginia is the anchor of these colonies. She's the largest, she's the wealthiest, she's the most populous of the colonies. And so in thinking about a leader that would draw the most support, they had to find somebody who would represent the largest of these colonies. And in this case, it was George Washington.
We've got a question from Annalise, age 11, and she asked if there was an opinion that was more common than any of the others in Williamsburg as the revolution began. Was it Patriot or Loyalist?
Would you like to answer, Stephen?
I can. Actually, we should probably both answer.
Sure,
because
sure.
honestly, you're never going to be able to see on paper the actual numbers. But what you do see in the primary sources is something that you even still see today and that you've seen in societies throughout time, which is status quo is easier. If you are used to a way of life, if you're used to things being woven into your lifestyle, if you're used to things day in and day out for generations going in a certain manner, the last thing you want in your life as you're living it is for something to come in the way of it and mess it up. So in that respect, what you're finding is that there are a lot of people who just don't understand what this change is about. As many as want this change are going, we're Britons. We're already the freest people in the world, as they used to say. Why would we want to leave them? Why would we want to do something, go somewhere else, be something else? I've tended to find that more than anything else. And as I said, once again, freed blacks and enslaved individuals, their perspectives were very different because in the end, they were trying to survive, they were trying to live, they were trying to stay with their families. This question didn't, in essence, matter to them in a lot of ways.
Stephen is right. It's very difficult for us to pin these numbers down. What you'll commonly hear is that about a third of the people in Williamsburg were in favor of independence, about a third were Tories or Loyalists, and about a third were what we might call fence sitters, people who hadn't made up their minds one way or the other. But something that's important for us to keep in mind is exactly what Stephen just said, is that there is a large population of enslaved people, and indeed there's even a small population of free blacks here in Williamsburg as well. And to be perfectly plain about it, to be perfectly blunt about it, if you don't mind, there aren't a lot of people who are considering the question of independence who are taking into account the opinions of their enslaved people over the matter. So what we know for sure is that these opinions were varied. We know that some people very likely held one opinion in public and one opinion in private, and did so for the sake of what Stephen mentioned again already, the sake of their families, the sake of their well-being. And certainly if they find themselves in a state of slavery, they're doing it, no doubt, for their livelihood.
We have a question from William, age 11, and Madeline, age 9. Do they have a record of the number of enslaved people in Williamsburg who did run for their freedom or fought for the British during the war?
That's a good question. We don't know those exact numbers. Part of the reason for that is that though there are a lot of primary sources on the enslaved, most of them are not personal accounts. Much of what you read comes from either their owners or people who happen to be around those that were enslaved. So what you're going to find is that those records are going to have, for you young ones, look up the word, but bias. And if you look up where you find bias, you find it everywhere. It's everywhere. You can't not have bias in something. Something, in essence, having a slant into a certain mode, in essence. And because of that, you have to look at all of these sources and go, who wrote this? What was their point of view? What did they think? And why are they writing this? No one writes something just to say, I want people to chronicle forever the things that I did wrong. That's usually not what people say when they're writing down their history or writing down records of things. So the numbers that you might see or people might talk about, there tends to be some sort of bias to them. The numbers were definitely in the thousands at least, not from Williamsburg alone, if you're talking about Virginia and you're talking about the other colonies that become states, because you just don't have Dunmore's proclamation in Virginia, but you also have the Phillipsburg Proclamation. There are a number of different things that the British were doing at the beginning of the war, and then by the time you get later on in the war, that then the Americans, specifically in Rhode Island, are also offering freedom to enslaved blacks who want to join the cause. So yeah, the numbers are, I don't think we'll ever know what the numbers are, but I would say that tried to run off to the British, it's thousands.
We have a great question from Deanna. She asks if you have ever almost answered a question and the answer was not the historical answer, or did you ever want to say something that perhaps the character you were portraying might not have said?
That is an awesome question.
Yes.
Thank you, Deanna. The answer is certainly, absolutely. This is a rare moment for Stephen and myself, I will say. Typically, you'll see me and I'll be George Wythe. Or you'll see Stephen and he'll be James Armistead Lafayette, or he'll be Mr. Mosby. And so the ability to answer questions out of character is something that we relish when we get the chance to do so.
Yeah.
And sometimes, people ask questions with certain assumptions. One of the assumptions that people make very commonly is that if you hold an opinion that might be considered loyalist or Tory, then you should go back to England. What they're assuming there, though, is that you came from England, or that you even have ever been to England at all. And we know for certain that most of the people who are living in Williamsburg in 1775, whether they be Patriot or loyalists, or, like we said, fence-sitters right in the middle, most of these people have been established in America for generations.
And the enslaved too.
And enslaved in America for generations. That's absolutely true. Mr. Wythe, for example, he is a fourth-generation American. I don't know if you know Mr. Mosby's or James Armistead Lafayette's family lineage in that same light.
Mosley's unfortunately not. James Lafayette's unfortunately not. Records are very interesting in that respect when you're talking about Black Virginians. But having said that, what you do find in the records is that there are more enslaved individuals in Virginia that are Virginia-born than are brought in to the colony at the time. Virginia was the first colony to end the slave trade, and it wasn't because they believed the slave trade was wrong, it was because their numbers of the enslaved were growing enough internally that they didn't have to bring in individuals from the African coast. So, that's really what you're finding.
One of the things, if you don't mind me saying, Stephen,
please.
that I think is important to note is that with both of these characters, so far as I'm aware, people, I shouldn't say characters, both of these people, as far as I am aware, there is no mention of them speaking English as a second language, or any markings or anything that might identify them or be perceived as African in origin. And as a result, I would assume, because of the number of people that have been living here for generations, enslaved people, who have been living here for generations, that they were born here. Very likely their parents were born here, and you might even surmise that their parents and their parents were born here as well.
Our next question is from Christina. She asks if women generally felt the same way as the shopkeeper, Katherine Rothel, who spoke earlier. Do we know if there was a general opinion among the women of the day? I would say that it would be difficult to have one whole group of people represented in one shared opinion. In much the same way that it would be difficult to respond to how all women in Williamsburg felt about an issue. The same could be said for all Americans think the same way about an issue today. So it's that variety of opinions, of perspectives and experiences that form the individual opinion. We know that there certainly were many women who had very strong opinions about the revolution, though. Robert, Stephen, any other response you'd like to add?
I think you're absolutely right, Cash. When we think about women and their opinions on the war, they're going to be just as varied as any of the men. And what's really wonderful, I think, about what we do here at Colonial Williamsburg is that when you come to visit us, once we are opened again, will have the opportunity to speak to these different types of folks and learn what they thought about it, and even better than learn what they thought, learn why they held the opinion that they did.
Our next question comes from Myra. She asks if there is any evidence that loyalists were more likely to return to England than individuals who were born in America who might have been loyal to the king.
That's a good question. I think we both probably have answers
I'm
for
sure
that.
we do.
Yeah, so early on, what you're finding with these committees that are being put together to deal with non-exportation and all these other things that are happening with legislation, as the sentiment starts to shift in many of the different colonies towards independence becoming inevitable, despite the fact that most of the population, the vast majority, haven't really made the choice towards independence yet, is that you're finding that a lot of voices are being silenced. And you'll see a lot of records of individuals who are considered Tory or are considered British-leaning to either be quieted, jailed, beaten. A number of these things are happening, and there are a number of individuals, some of the more well-known ones, like John Randolph, who takes his family and he goes to England. I shouldn't say back to England because his family wasn't from there.
He was born in a house just a few hundred yards away from where we are right now, in the middle of Colonial Williamsburg. Indeed.
And so there were some that went to England. The problem that they ran into there is that, by and large, the British did not necessarily consider the Americans to be on the same level as far as class was concerned. Class was very important in the 18th century within the society. So many individuals that were considered gentry or the highest of the creme de la creme here would go back to England, and they would not be considered on the same status as those individuals that they thought were on the same level as them. So for a number of individuals, going to England that wasn't their home. America was their home. It was just like with the enslaved. They talked about, well, if we free the enslaved individuals, well, then we can ship them all back to Africa. And the issue with that is that Africa's not their home. America's their home. They were born here. And I don't know about you, but when you're connected to a place that you're born in, no matter what, that's where you want to live. That's where you want to breathe and have your family. That's where you want to die. And that's the thing to keep in mind with the enslaved as well as with the free people that were here in Virginia at the time.
And not to mention, Stephen, I mean, everything you say is right on the money. Speaking of money, it is incredibly expensive to go to England.
Yep.
There is an example that comes to mind of, I believe it was Peyton Randolph in the 1750s, travels to England to petition on behalf of the Americans because of a political issue that was happening here in Virginia. And he's gone for several months, almost a year. And in that time, he racks up a debt of, if I'm not mistaken, about £1,000, which is an incredible amount of money. If you think about a journeyman, a skilled worker here in Williamsburg has for themselves about 35, 40 pounds in a year. And so the notion of traveling to Great Britain, again, as you say, not necessarily going back, but going there with basically nothing, is so incredibly daunting. I kind of compare it to me, Robert, in this year of 2020, deciding that I'm just going to go to the moon. I mean, it's almost that difficult.
Our next question is, what happened to the Loyalists who decided to remain in Virginia? Were they able to still share their opinions of support for the king?
That's a really great question, and it's an important one for us to ask because oftentimes when we talk about loyalists, well, I suppose what I mean to say is that we oftentimes don't talk about loyalists at all.
No.
We either assume that they aren't here, or that they've been run off, or that they're going to keep their mouths shut. And that's not necessarily what happens. Typically speaking, what happens here in Virginia, if someone is voicing an opinion in opposition to what we might consider to be the main channel of thought, the principal channel of thought being the Patriot cause, that person could very well be visited by the Committees of Safety. The Committees of Safety are organizations that are put together by people of like mind, meaning Patriot cause, to enforce these opinions amongst their neighbors. If you've been here to Colonial Williamsburg, you may have seen across the street from the Raleigh Tavern a pole. On the pole there are the words, "A cure for the refractory." The refractory meaning such as when you refract light for the splinters, those who think differently than the rest of us. And hanging on that pole is a bag of feathers and a barrel of tar. Now, I will say I don't know off the top of my head of anyone here in Williamsburg who was tarred and feathered. But the point is that there was the threat. These Committees of Safety might very well come over to your house in the middle of the night if they find out that you decided you're going to import and sell tea. They could very well visit a ship out, let's just say, out in Yorktown, and throw some tea over into the water, reminiscent of a particular, I think you might call it a party. They didn't call it a party, but we might call it a party. All of these things, these threats, are things that are events that those who held differing opinions may have, and some people definitely did endure. But these are varying events, to be sure. We know of one gentleman by the name of either Ralph or Rafe, depending on how he pronounced it, Wormley, who was active in Virginia's government prior to the war. He no doubt was a student of Thomas Hobbes. He supported the government that was in power at the time. And as a result, he supported the British government. He was essentially banished to his outermost, westwardmost estate. He remained there throughout the course of the war, and at the end of the war, he became involved in Virginia's politics again.
Our next question is from Violet. She asked if you are able to tell us more about your characters. Are they historical people or are they historical fiction?
Well, shall I start?
Please do.
John Mosley was a real person. We somewhat know his circa date of birth. It's somewhere around 1756 to 1758. What we know for sure in the records that we've been able to find is that he was enslaved in Virginia, probably in Prince Anne County, that he joined the British Army, and that he was one of the individuals that the British evacuated when they were evacuating the former enslaved individuals, and he originally was sent to England. And we find in the records that he actually ends up being arrested for stealing money from a friend, actually, and ends up being sentenced to death. And what ends up happening, instead of him being sentenced to death, it's commuted, and he is instead sent to Botany Bay, Australia, of all places. And he gets there. He eventually gains his freedom from being incarcerated again, and he actually becomes a businessman in Botany Bay, Australia. He has workers that are working for him. Apparently he had a pretty good business. He lived into his 80s. But the unfortunate part is that there's so many things within the middle of those parts of his life that we unfortunately don't have records on. But it made me so happy to be able to find at least where he was born, those things that he did in his life, and where he died. So he was a true-to-life character, person, and we actually have quite a bit of information on him.
That must have really raised your eyebrows when you saw where he died.
Yeah, Botany Bay, Australia, of all the places in the world. Yeah.
Incredible. For me, George Wythe was indeed a real person. He, as I said, was born here in Virginia at the end of 1726 or early 1727. He studied the law under his uncle, a gentleman by the name of Stephen Dewey. He practiced in both the county courts and then eventually the general court here in Virginia. He would go on to be famously the tutor of Thomas Jefferson. I think I may have mentioned that previously, and a number of other gentlemen here in Virginia whose names are famous in especially Colonial Williamsburg. In addition to that, he served for a year as mayor of Williamsburg. He served in the Second Virginia Convention. And if you look on the Declaration of Independence, you'll find his name at the top of the Virginia delegation.
We have time enough for one last question. I'd love to hear your thoughts as well on why it was so important to have different opinions, different perspectives, even as something as important as the American Revolution was beginning. Was it necessary to have those different points of view?
Of course. When it comes to something simple, you might go and ask the advice of a friend. When it comes to something really important, you might ask several friends. And they might all give you differing opinions on the matter. When it comes to independence, it's easy for us in this year of 2020 to look back and say, obviously this was the right thing to do. But here's the question. Was it the right thing to do for everybody? We know for certain that many people, even those who were spitfires for the cause of independence, lost a great deal of money. Even people here, like the Gettys here in Williamsburg, lost incredible amounts, their entire fortunes, fighting this war, or over the course of the war at the very least. In addition to that, families were split. People lost their lives. Disease was rampant in a lot of places. Lots of people, as Stephen mentioned, were made promises that simply weren't kept. I don't think that it's my job as an interpreter to tell you whether or not America should have declared independence, but it's my job to give you Mr. Wythe's opinion on the matter so that you are better informed as to what actually happened. And again, that's something that's really wonderful about Colonial Williamsburg, I think, is when you come back here and visit us, or you come and visit me, I say me, Mr. Wythe in his house over here on the Palace Green, you can ask him about his opinions. I think I made mention earlier that in 1765, in the early parts leading up to, or in the early of the decade leading up to American independence, Mr. Wythe was an establishment guy. And yet in 1775, he's calling for independence on the floor of the Congress. Something happened. Something changed his mind. And I would be willing to bet that his mind was changed because of the opinions of those who were around him.
Opinions are important, no matter who you are. Those of you that are young and watching this today, you know that you have very strong opinions on this world and on the things that you've seen. But you also probably know that at this point in your life, you have the power to speak those things, but sometimes you may not have the power to change those things. But that doesn't make your opinion any less valid because you can't do anything about what's happening around you. When I look at my ancestors, of those, most of whom were enslaved, they all had opinions. They all wanted family. They all wanted to have a life of their own. I'm sure they all wanted to be free. They had those opinions. And though they had those opinions, in a lot of ways, sometimes they could do small things to try to work towards it. But the society was so stacked against them being able to survive that maybe those opinions were never put out there, but they were there. And it's important to know those opinions. It's good to understand that we all don't have to look at things the same way to be Americans. We don't all have to look at things the same way to even be able to have the conversations. There was a time in this country where there was a large sect of the population whose opinion did not matter. We have learned in our modern times that that is not a way that a country works, and that is not a way that you have a society that is ready to evolve in the way that our founding documents were written by our founding fathers and our founding mothers to help us to evolve. Those opinions are important. Your opinions are important. My opinions are important. But if we aren't teaching our history in the manner of letting you all know that there were all of these different opinions, how are you going to know just how important your opinion may be to change this world one day in the way that you want to?
On May of 1776, the Americans were faced with a great decision. How would they proceed? Would they move away from the king and parliament that had started their colonies over 150 years earlier with the first permanent English settlement at Jamestown? Or would they begin a new American custom of self-government and self-rule? Tomorrow we will be live at the Capitol building at 2 o'clock, and we will commemorate that decision being made with Edmund Pendleton's resolutions for American independence. I hope that you'll be able to join us then. And if you would like to learn more about this and our other evening programs at Colonial Williamsburg, a link has been posted in the comments so that you can, if you would like to, join us in person for Revolutionary Points of View when we reopen. We'd love to hear what you think about the course of American independence and how we should proceed in that goal of freedom and liberty for all. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I hope that you all are healthy and safe until we see you back here in Colonial Williamsburg in person. Have a wonderful day.